From the Penn Institute for Urban Research and the Volcker Alliance, this is Special Briefing. I'm Bill Glasgall, and today our focus is the state of America's cities, and especially fiscal conditions, as the new federalism reorients the trillion-dollar-a-year relationship between Washington and state and local governments. I'm here today, of course, with our great co-host, Penn IUR co-director Susan Wachter. Hi, Susan.
Well, good morning.
We'll be getting to the details of today's program and to our panel, of course, in just a minute. But first, this word. Special briefings are made possible by funding from the Travelers Institute, the Volcker Alliance, and members of the Penn IUR Advisory Board. Thanks to you all. And we're coming to you live on the Penn IUR and Volcker Alliance websites, and also on the Special Briefing podcast and the Penn IUR YouTube channel. You can catch us almost anywhere these days. And as always, we've taken your questions in advance. So let's get down to work. We chose the state of the city, Susan and I did. We chose it as our focus today for a good reason. The World Bank reckons that 83% of Americans live in cities or urban areas, and that's part of a long-time population shift to metros that shows little signs of reversing. And right now, most cities are in good fiscal shape. The U.S. economy is growing at a torrid 5.4% rate in the first quarter, according to the Atlanta Fed GDP model, and 5.4% is beyond hot. That's really amazing. And that means that for most part, city tax revenues are also running pretty hot, and personal and corporate tax breaks in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed last year, that may extend this economic winning streak. And it'll help cities weather cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, or food stamps, as they're often known, and FEMA disaster aid, among others. How these trends balance out, well, that's the question of the year. To get to the bottom of all this, we're honored to kick off the program with Raleigh, North Carolina Mayor and former State Treasurer Janet Cowell, who, by the way, has an excellent article, along with one by me, on the new federalism in the latest issue of Expert Voices on the Penn IUR website. So after we're done, go over there and download the issue. After Janet, from the New York City Independent Budget Office, Senior Research Officer Sarah Parker will look at the challenges facing Mayor Zoran Mamdani, who had his first presser yesterday on his new budget plan. From Washington, D.C., let's welcome back Chief Economist Fitzroy Lee, and for some big-picture perspectives, we'll hear from PFM Group Consulting Managing Director Matt Stitt, also a repeat guest, and Moody's Ratings Public Finance Senior VP Nick Samuels. Welcome to you all. And now to get things going, Susan, would you please introduce your colleague and mine, Mayor Cowell?
Yes, it's such a great pleasure to introduce Mayor Cowell, who is coming to us from the Conference of Mayors. Mayor Cowell, prior to being elected mayor of Raleigh, North Carolina, was the state treasurer, the first and only woman for that elected office, which oversees all local finance. So bringing her expertise today, and we are so thrilled because besides being a Wharton graduate, Mayor Cowell is now joined our board, the Penn Institute for Urban Research. Mayor Cowell, please give us your overview of the city's financial conditions.
Well, thanks for having me today, Susan and Bill, and all the sponsors of today's program. I will say as mayor of Raleigh that we feel fairly optimistic about 2026, and I'll give you the three big headlines why that is. First is we are a growing city, and we do not have some of the capacity constraints that you see, in other places. Second, we have pretty good and stable financial resources. And the biggest risk, and this is probably a refrain you're going to hear about a lot today, is federal spending and state spending in North Carolina, and how they treat cities is the biggest risk. So going back to growth, Raleigh has crested 500,000 people metro, and we are still anticipating another 250,000, so another 250,000 people over the next 25 years. We topped the U-Haul list this year as the place where most people were renting U-Hauls to move to Raleigh. We still have land. We're 150 square miles. We have several tracts, so we still have land on the perimeter. but we are also redirecting a lot of 70% now of our zoning cases, permits, and things are more for redevelopment and infill inside city limits. We also have water supply. The city of Raleigh controls not just our water, but half of the Wake County, the county where we reside in with the Neuse River. So that has not been a constraining factor. And we are also investing in transit and road projects to keep up with the growth. Financially, we are, of course, smaller than some of the other cities you're going to hear from today. We're about $1.8 billion all in for our annual budget. We have property tax as the foundation for our revenue. We have not had some of the caps and restraints that I've heard from other mayors and other states. But there are increasing exemptions, and as is a trend across the country, people are looking at, should there be more exemptions? Our property tax is too high, particularly as we talk about affordability and affordable housing. So that is a potential threat, on the horizon. But for now, still very solid, and sales taxes have been flat. But we still have fees and things that we control through, water, sewer, and trash, et cetera. We also have debt capacity. The city of Raleigh is AAA rated by all rating agencies. We know Moody's is on the line today, and we have $200 million where we're trying to do steady state resources without raising taxes. We can do $200 million of debt. And also, as something you'll probably hear from other cities today, we're in the good position that the state Treasurer's Office runs the pension funds. Those have traditionally been well funded, and it is not a burden where we have a lot of control or things. So we pay in as a city, but there's not a lot of flexibility there. It's pretty much a good and solid sidebar. We do have the potential. Recently, Charlotte in the state of North Carolina passed a 1 penny transportation sales tax. So in the event that we see reductions, in federal and state dollars, that is a steam release valve potentially for counties in the Triangle region. That is just a very early stage conversation, so I don't want to overstate that, but that is one potential additional authority that we have. In terms of risk, the Research Triangle, as y'all would know just from the word Research Triangle, is about research universities, UNC Chapel Hill, Duke University, and North Carolina State University, which is in Raleigh. I'm wearing red because that is also an NC State color, but it's also a Penn color. And unfortunately, that has been an area already where federal cuts have impacted. I think the numbers I have are $580 million in cuts, which is 25% of the total among those major research universities. And it has impacted organizations like FHI 360, which was primarily about international health and global health research. So that has had more, particularly Durham, Chapel Hill. But the other things that I get concerned about, I went to Capitol Hill earlier in 2025 to lobby for transportation dollars. That's our biggest exposure, where we really do need those federal dollars to keep investing in our bus rapid transit system, our high-speed rail, the S-line system. And the initial response I got from my congressional delegation was pretty good. Also worrisome, you saw 2 weeks ago, there was a $2 billion national statewide, all across the country cut to mental health assistance, housing assistance, substance abuse assistance, suicide prevention, these sort of bread and butter on the street issues that really affect cities. That was reinstated within 24 hours, but it just illustrates the instability and potential impacts that could be had. So that's, I'll stop there and again, just sort of reiterate, we feel optimistic that we're a growing community with a number of levers and ways we can accommodate that growth, good finances, but the risk does become, that federal relationship and how they look at cities and fund cities, as well as in North Carolina, conservative General Assembly that at times looks more to their rural constituency and away from the democratically controlled urban areas.
Thank you so much, Mayor, for that relatively sunny report from a growing city of Raleigh with some concerns about infrastructure and transit and uncertainty about federal funds. We will have questions and answers for the mayor and everyone on the panel after we complete panel opening remarks. And we now turn to Sarah Parker from a bigger city, from New York City. And Sarah Parker is the Senior Research and Strategy Officer of New York City's Independent Budget Office, and I underline independent. So what's the view from New York City, Sarah?
Well, first, thank you, Bill and Susan, for having me here today. I'm here from the New York City Independent Budget Office. We are a city agency that is tasked with reporting on the city's financial health and its local economy, independent from all elected officials. And just for a little bit of context, New York City's annual expense budget this fiscal year is $118 billion. And we also have a $173 billion 10-year capital plan. New York City's annual expense budget is larger than all but 3 states in the country. There's 3 central topics that our office has been thinking about recently, and I'm going to cover today. First, although this year's budget is balanced, and that's required under by law, New York City is facing budget gaps starting next year. The second piece that we're thinking about is what are strategies that New York City could use to address these gaps, both from an expense side and from a revenue side. And lastly, we've been thinking a lot about New York City's relationship with our state capital, Albany, especially in a time when the federal relationships with both states and cities has really shifted in dynamic. So first, Mayor Mamdani has inherited a very tight fiscal position. New York City, our office estimated last month, is facing budget gaps of about $6 to $8 billion across its financial plan period. And for context, this is about 8 to 10% of our city's local tax revenue. In past, the city has closed gaps that were closer to 5 to 6% of tax revenue. So this is indicating we have a slightly heavier lift ahead of us. To address that, there's thoughts about what can we do on the expense side. Yesterday, in a press conference, the mayor said he's ordering a top-down review of city spending and programs to find places where there could be efficiencies. There's also discussions on what the city does for its own workforce. Does it institute a hiring freeze? Does it continue a 2-for-1 replacement that it's had in place over recent years? And then there's also more out-of-the-box discussions that are happening. Something that came up last year in Albany that we expect to be brought up again this year in discussions is a question about the pension payment schedule. So New York City annually puts about $10 billion towards covering its local pension system. And on the current payment schedule, the pensions will be fully funded by 2032. One proposal that came up last year was to reduce the payment amounts, but extend the period of time for those payments out to 2044. And certainly this has implications for both the time value of money, questions about intergenerational funding, who's paying for what in terms of the current workforce and retirees, and also what it signals to investors. On the revenue side, we think about revenues very closely tied to our local economy. 2 of the largest local taxes we have are real property tax and our personal income tax. For the real property tax, recently, just this month, the city put out a very strong assessment roll. So property values are maintaining their worth, and we expect real property taxes to remain steady. This has traditionally been a local tax that is very consistent year to year and predictable. There's been a lot of concern about commercial real estate and concerns about the doom loop that office space was going to fall into. That has not happened. And as our office has forecasted, there is a settling into what we've termed a new normal, where office leasings have adjusted to hybrid work schedules where corporations are perhaps leasing less square footage, but they are seeking out higher quality buildings. And so there's been really strong movement in leasings for a high-end office space. On the personal income tax side, Wall Street has had a very strong year. And for a city where much of our economy is tied to the financial sector, this has very good implications for the city's personal income tax. But underlying that, the city only added 40,000 jobs this past year, and that's about half of the number of jobs that the city has been adding in years when the local economy was very strong. So that's something we're carefully watching. Lastly, I just want to touch upon our state partnerships with Albany. Much of the proposals that Mayor Mamdani has put forward require either state approval or state support financially. So any proposal to change tax rates, to increase taxes on high income earners, that has to come from the Albany legislature. And we certainly expect much debate happening as Albany has its sessions this spring. Questions about free buses. He has a proposal to make buses free and fast. Our bus system is operated through the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. That is a state-run authority. So any of those discussions will involve the authority, the governor, and the mayor. And also he campaigned and has focused on increasing childcare, particularly providing childcare for 2-year-olds and to expand childcare vouchers. Now, this is something where Governor Hochul, in her budget proposal, put funding in for childcare and has signaled a real partnership in making this happen. So that's also something that we're looking to. The relationship of a city and a state is becoming even more crucial, and even that dynamic has shifted as the relationship between the federal government and states and cities has really become much more tenuous. So to reiterate, we have budget gaps that we're facing starting next year. There's a lot of options on how to close those, but it's going to require some strategic thinking before really anyone can turn to thinking about funding new programs. And if ever, our partnerships with Albany, both Governor Hochul and the state legislature, are more important than ever.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And let's take up taxes, pensions, and federal-state-city relations in general during the Q&A. And one thing to note: New York City has a balanced budget, in part and largely, really, because of the efforts of our late friend and mentor Dick Ravitch, who campaigned for gap budgeting in New York. And New York remains the only large government in the entire United States that follows gap straight through for its budget, and more power to them. We're going to go from New York to Washington, D.C. and Fitzroy Lee. We've talked in the past about the impact of federal workforce cuts and federal spending cuts in general on D.C. That's sort of a county and sort of a state and a city besides. So Fitzroy, tell me, what are you looking for in the coming year?
Thank you, Bill. Thanks again for inviting me, and thank you, Susan. And so I will start by talking about the economic setting for the district and then the impact that has had on our fiscal outlook. As the nation's capital, of course, we are disproportionate hosting of federal jobs. And so the federal workforce downsizing presents the biggest challenge to the district's economy for the year ahead. The November jobs report shows that the district lost almost 30,000 jobs. That's about 4% of all jobs since January. And the losses, as you can expect, were primarily from the loss of federal jobs. We lost 24,000, and that represented about 13% of the federal jobs. We also lost another 5,000 in professional and business services, a category that includes many federal contracting jobs. Leisure and hospitality posted slight gains, and health and education declined slightly. Unemployment rate rose from 5.3% in January to 6.5% in November. So that's the jobs picture. We have expanded work from home since the pandemic continues to be a challenge for the districts, although it's getting a little better. And even that's in spite of an executive order that returned federal workers to in-office work 5 days a week. According to Castle Systems data, which track weekly office access card swipes, in the second week of January, there were 56% of weekly office access card swipes were at 56% in cities, and 8 percentage points above what they were a year ago. And according to CoStar, a real estate consultancy, the office vacancy rate stood at 8.4% in the quarter that ended in December. And that's 7% higher than it was pre-pandemic level. But the good news here is that the CoStar data shows that rents have stabilized and the vacancy rate is expected to fall going forward as the gap between supply and demand closes. And that's a better forecast than we've had for a while. Turning to the population, the DC population continues to recover from pandemic-related losses, even though net domestic migration remains negative. The population estimates for DC that was released on Tuesday revised downward the previous estimates for 2020 through 2024, with 2024 estimate lowered by 10,940. Despite this, the district saw a population increase of about over 2,000 between 2024 and 2025, largely driven by natural change, and that is births minus deaths. And international migration added the most, almost 4,000 residents, but which was mostly offset by a net 4,000 in domestic migration. Turning to, what does this mean for our budget? The budget and financial plan for fiscal year 2026 to 2029 was finalized in June last year. And just to note, the DC fiscal year begins in October, like the federals, and unlike many other states that begin in July. But that budget anticipated the fiscal impact of the federal workforce reduction and incorporated a revenue reduction of about $300 million per year. That's about 3% of the district's $11 billion local source revenue. The district balances budget and financial plan mainly by right-sizing spending and use of some reserve. There were no tax increases, but there was a few fee increases. And the district also has a practice of revising its revenue estimate quarterly. And in September, just before the start of the fiscal year, the revenue estimate was updated. The update revised revenue upward by just under $300 million for fiscal year 2026. That's the year we're in now. And by 100 to 160 million for the remaining in the out years, because we do have a 4-year budget and financial plan. The revision mostly reflected better than expected tax revenue from capital gains and corporate profits. This is a risk for the district as these are among the more volatile revenue sources and are driven by financial market bets and returns from the AI boom. The revision also incorporated revenue reductions from the tax provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Following the revenue estimate, the district council did pass legislation to decouple the DC income tax system from most of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act provisions and to recoup the resultant revenue loss. The budget, by the way, did anticipate some of the changes, especially those around Medicaid. The biggest fear that was had was anticipating change to the federal medical assistance percentage rate, the FMAP, which didn't happen. So that was a big relief. The other changes were around, of course, requirements, which the district has since adjusted to, and then the provider fees. The district never depended a lot on those provider fees, so they were able to make the small adjustments needed. And then there was also adjustment to the state-directed payments. Again, the district was provided some relief for 2026. And as we go into the development of the 2027 budget, they're going to make the changes to ensure that we have a balanced budget. As with many other state and local government, we have to have a balanced budget. And so we will make the changes. Just to wrap up, I'll look at some of the risks as we look into the years ahead. Of course, the impact of the federal government layoffs poses the greatest risk to the district outlook. If the federal layoffs exceed the forecast, revenue may be lower than forecast. And conversely, if the layoffs are below the forecast, and we're seeing some signs that they might be rehiring people because to provide the services, they're realizing they need these people. if those are less than the forecast, the policies have already reduced tourism-related revenues and will continue to pose a risk to the district's leisure and hospitality sector. The forecast, as I mentioned before, includes revenue from capital gains and corporate profits, making the financial market performance a key risk for the district. And then finally, the district's dependence on net international migration as a driver of population growth is of some concern because of stricter immigration policies. So I will stop there and be ready for the questions.
Well, thank you so much, Fitzroy. I'm struck by Washington. Washington's population growing. North Carolina, Raleigh, you kind of expect it, but New Jersey was also in the top 10 growers again among states. And maybe we should, Susan, maybe we should come back and look at demographic shifts with all the immigration restrictions and see who's growing and who's shrinking. California shrank in the last estimates. It's an interesting topic for taxes. With that, this is a reminder that you are tuned into special briefing from Penn IUR and the Volcker Alliance. And thanks again to the Travelers Institute, the Volcker Alliance, and members of the Penn IUR Advisory Board for your support. And don't forget, you can follow today's episode and all of our other special briefings on our websites, the Special Briefing Podcast, and the Penn IUR YouTube channel. And now, let's turn to Matt Stitt, former Philadelphia City Council CFO, but you know a lot more about other cities as well. Matt, you've told me about some of the challenges your clients are talking about, like housing and childcare and inflation. Tell us what's top of mind right now for you.
Absolutely. And let me just start with some themes that I think a lot of cities are still kind of entering this budget season with. There's affordability is a big theme. There's a lot of cities that are still concerned on how to make their cities or keep their cities affordable. Resiliency. I'm sure a lot of bad weather weekend, right? In terms particularly related to infrastructure spending and service delivery around that, with potentially changing weather in certain places, but also growth and vibrancy. So, despite trying to keep places more affordable, there's still a big push of new policies to recover their downtowns and make them more vibrant and grow again. In regards to funding challenges, many cities and our counties are preparing for how to maintain service delivery despite federal cuts. This is partially being reflected in budget and 5-year plans, forecast by some cities placing more money into their reserves. Governments are also one more year into what normal return to work looks like and what that means for their budgets, revenue, and workplace resource needs and cultures. Having more historicals on how revenue expenses have structurally changed since the pandemic and how urban centers' commercial activity have or have not rebounded, and now being more fully built into these forecasts. Because of this, there have been some cities looking at both sides of the ledger to become more in balance or back on a revenue growth trajectory. Combination of what costs could be eliminated or shared or replaced with technology and potential changes to existing taxes, how and who is being taxed versus pre-pandemic, to alternative revenue streams to support areas like local transit and housing. As an example, the city of Philadelphia has put a lot more money into reserves to help mitigate these potential cuts into their 5-year forecasts. Many cities are also taking deeper looks at the shifting tax base and tax policy in response to post-pandemic activity, in addition to other factors. This has led to an increase of looking at alternative revenue sources, including non-tax revenues or fees, to ensure they are maximizing fiscal return in order to avoid raising other taxes. Many places are also taking a deeper look at the performance of their tax incentives and subsidies to see if the subsidy is necessary to achieve the goal of the incentive in an effort to potentially shift financial resources to another priority. For instance, City of Philadelphia started a tax reform commission last year, which led to a study in hopes of creating a tax policy and base that will be more attractive to business and residents, while the city also maintains healthy revenue growth and reserves. Many cities are still a little bit concerned about the shifting tariff policies, maybe not for this upcoming year because the reserves are pretty strong going into this year, but what does it mean into the outer years of their plans? In addition to looking for additional revenue, there are also a number of areas that cities continue to prioritize from a budgeting or funding standpoint. This includes, which I think we heard earlier, housing. Affordable and workforce housing investments continue to remain a priority for many cities. And in the city that we're in, Philadelphia, the mayor is poised to invest upwards of $2 billion in affordable and workforce housing in the coming years. Public transit. Despite cuts and reduced ridership, many urban cities continue to focus on how to invest in their public transit systems to make them more stabilized and resilient. And then we've heard this earlier as well, but there continues to be some concern around workforce challenges as well. Though many places have filled vacancies since the pandemic, the working population continues to get older. And then the work culture continues to shift. It's probably a little bit more known now, but it's still an issue when it comes to certain cities when trying to attract and retain talent. And the last priority I will mention, which I think is a little bit newer in some places, is actually childcare. And how can cities help subsidize childcare where some of those cuts may be as well?
Well, thank you so much. Great to have you back again, Matt, on this picture of where cities are right now and the new normal after the pandemic and work from home, and yet the new pressures from affordability, possibly the significant problems with transit. And at the same time, huge changes coming perhaps with artificial intelligence and growing older workforce. So a lot to be considered in the long term. But now we'll get back to where we are at this moment and turn to our next speaker, who we're pleased to have with us, who is Nick Samuels, who is Senior Vice President at Moody's. Nick, give us an oversight of cities' finances across the country.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. And I think there'll be a lot of mutual validation in my comments with the other speakers. So, let me start big picture, and then I'll try to distill it down a bit. Overall growth will be slower, and we've heard the mayor say this. State policy decisions might be key drivers of local budgeting. So, just some context there. Economic growth will be slower, and that will mean slower revenue growth. We forecast that real U.S. GDP in calendar 2026 will be 1.8%, and it will remain below 2% in 2027. And by comparison, our forecast for calendar 2025 was that it was 2%. So slower economic growth will translate into slower but steady revenue growth, both at the state level and the local government level. For states, we forecast between 2 and 3% revenue growth in 26. For local governments, between 3 and 4%, but for both of those at the lower end of the range. For local government, that's really is a return to the long-term trend, but that follows many years of above average revenue growth. And that really may have to drive a recalibration among local budgeters of what revenue looks like and what they can do with their budgets. In that context, spending changes at the state level have the capacity to ripple down through local government budgets and require cities to adjust spending priorities or revenue strategies. Maybe there's some opportunities there for local governments, but maybe there's more risk on the downside. Caps on local tax authority, state-imposed borrowing limits, things like that, also are going to constrain some cities' ability to respond to emerging needs, especially where population growth is the strongest, like some of the places that we've just spoken about, and where demand for services is growing the strongest. So that also has the potential to really drive some harder budget decisions. And then policy shifts at the state level regarding education or healthcare or housing can create unfunded mandates for local governments that they will have to confront in their budgets as well. All of the speakers right up until now, and I will be no different, are talking about federal policy risk, and those remain a credit risk for cities and counties as well. Federal funding is a meaningful share of local budgets, particularly for social programs and infrastructure. Programs like Medicaid, transportation grants, those are essential to maintaining service levels and capital investment. Medicaid, especially if you have a municipal hospital enterprise or another municipal healthcare enterprise, money through those programs is very important. But changes at the federal level where, for example, eligibility becomes more constrained will create budget challenges and credit challenges as well. Changes in some of those programs, right, also will force cities to at least consider Do they backfill gaps in those programs? What do they do to confront that? If they don't have the ability to create some sort of backfill, what is the political and economic risk that less spending on those types of social programs or infrastructure programs or whatever it is, what does that create for the local economy? And I think one important one to talk about there is changes in federal disaster response policy. There have been changes at the federal level about how to approach disaster aid that might require local governments, state and local governments, to bear more of that cost burden. And that could be a challenge, especially where some of those physical climate risks are the highest. It's January 29th. We might be getting into another federal government shutdown soon. That kind of fiscal gridlock in Washington introduces some timing risk related to grant flows and capital projects, and just creates an overall environment of uncertainty about federal policy and federal funding that can at least complicate budgeting now, can complicate long-term planning, and in some cases could impact credit profiles. While the economy seems to be doing really well, right? The job market has become soft, and maybe it is becoming soft in some high-paying industries as well. And so, another risk in the outlook is that wealth-linked revenue streams, are vulnerable to market cycles. And stock market slowdowns really don't directly hit most cities, but they can affect property transaction-driven revenue, especially in high wealth areas. And so when high-end real estate activity slows, related tax revenue can drop, can create budget gaps, and that adds more volatility into local budgeting as well. Tourism and retail sales taxes fluctuate with broader economic confidence and discretionary spending. Yesterday, right, the news came out that consumer confidence has fallen to the lowest level since 2014, and that and an economic downturn can lead to reduced tourism and travel, fewer big ticket purchases, and weakened sales tax performance. Lastly, a really important emerging theme is that affordability pressures are a growing structural and credit risk. Housing costs, childcare costs, those are consuming a lot of household budgets, and that limits economic mobility and constrain local economies. And just some context there, in 3 of the 10 largest U.S. cities, the combination of rent and childcare, transportation, and taxes consume more than 60% of household income. So those kinds of rising living costs reduce disposable income, they dampen consumer spending, they reduce tax revenues, they can influence migration patterns and workforce availability. And then the flip side of that coin, right, is that governments seeking to address affordability in their own policy agendas, expanded housing programs, subsidized childcare, something like that, governments are looking to address those things, but those are ongoing costs. And so balancing those affordability goals with recurring revenue in an environment of maintaining credit stability is a challenge. And then, I'll end on this last point. Cost of living can erode tax bases over time as migration patterns shift towards lower cost regions. We've talked a little bit about the new population numbers that came out this week. The prime example of that is that, the biggest winner was South Carolina. But the outmigration of middle income households from more expensive areas can weaken property tax growth and sales tax collections, poses a long-term credit risk for cities where that can't address affordability or where affordability is really a challenge.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. Let me start off with that question. We have a number of questions from previously submitted questions, but on affordability and particularly to you, Mayor Cowell, is this a risk in Raleigh? That how have housing prices done there, and to your forecast of continued growth, and more generally to all panelists, how much is the consumer weakness a concern, and particularly around affordability going forward?
Affordability is absolutely the number one issue in Raleigh. For years, folks thought, okay, it's a cheap place to live, good schools, etc. Now it's a relatively cheap place nationally, but locally has had, repercussions on long-term residents who've had to move out of the city and out of the county because of now I think one bedroom rental is around $1,800, $1,700. That's, our average median income doubled from, 40 to 80,000. Everything just the inflationary COVID era was just very impactful. So we are one of the things we're doing with that debt capacity is we are probably $100 million affordable housing bond for the next 4 years to enhance subsidized housing, which is still only 10% of our market, but at least try to do everything we can to keep the larger supply moving, but then also address the very acute needs at the low end of the market.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that, Janet? And I think everybody else, and Nick especially, may want to chime in. Raleigh's not the only city that's looking at affordable housing bonds. Philly has an enormous housing bond issue in prospect, and New York City has plans, still kind of vague. What about raising money in the bond market for housing? How widespread is this going to be? Nick, what are you seeing? Just sort of generally.
There are many states and local governments that do issue debt to address affordable housing, and that's one tool that they have. And I think that investors have only been receptive to that. But that's only one tool in sort of an array of things that I think we see local governments doing. Issuing debt specifically themselves for affordable housing. You see efforts about changing zoning in former industrial areas or much more mixed use development, trying to ease permitting and other types of regulations to make housing finance move more quickly, right? Because the real problem is, this imbalance where demand vastly exceeds supply, and especially in a lot of cities, that is the case. I mean, I will use the example of New York City, where I think the residential rental vacancy rate, Sarah can confirm this for me, is something like 1.4%. I mean, that's extraordinarily low.
On the housing front, we will do a special briefing on that. It's so important. But I do want to get back to the question. I'm really puzzled by this. Nick's forecast is 2%. Is that the forecast of others on the call for their city's GNP, if you may, or is it somewhat more bullish given the fact that we've come off of faster growth? Because it seems to be a very key issue that Nick rightly raises, that growth has been high. If it slows down, it's going to be a more difficult environment. Maybe Fitzroy, we start with you.
Yes, thanks again. So actually, our growth for this year in terms of revenue is down, and mostly driven by the fact that we're expecting lower employment, lower salaries, and so on. So we're forecasting a 1.5% drop in revenue growth this year, but we do bounce back starting next year, and it's much in line with what Nick has said in terms of 2%. So Nick made a good point in terms of for years, and part of this, we have had growth that's more between 3 and 4, and some years 5%. Now going forward in the long term, we're talking about growth more in line with between 2 and 3%. So we did reflect coming out of the pandemic, and mostly because we have had downward pressure on our real property tax revenue, because we in the district depended a lot on commercial office property. We have had a downward trend. And then now that to add to that, we're looking at lower employment, lower wages and salaries. And so we're not looking at more than 2% or so growth going forward
in this coming year, and then back to 2 to 3, which is consistent with Nick. Right. Sarah, what are your projections?
So we've been looking a lot at the jobs being added in New York City, and in particular, as I mentioned, this past year we added about 40,000 jobs, and that's a pretty pretty tepid job market in terms of adding for the local economy. And the majority of those new jobs being added were around social service and sector, ambulatory healthcare aides. And so these are not high-paying jobs. It's certainly something that we are looking at in terms of what that means for employment and personal income tax. And then obviously tourism is a major draw for New York City's local economy, and questions about international tourists tend to stay longer, spend more money. So if there's a shift away from international tourism, from business travel, and relying more on domestic travel, that's certainly going to impact both sales tax and the hotel tax that we have here. So things on our radar.
Matt, your thoughts on is growth decreasing, and is it around 2% that you're projecting for localities in Philly and more generally across the country?
I think that sounds about right. I do think some places might be a little bit more, conservative in our outer years, just given some of the uncertainty. Despite this year, a lot of the local governments still have some healthy reserves this year. I think they're focused. Obviously, they got to get a lot of these priorities and challenges are ongoing challenges, even before the pandemic, before federal cuts. And it's all about, how can you squeeze the resources to get more housing? I actually wanted to go back to your housing question for a second,
Please, go
Susan,
ahead.
because,
Please go ahead. Go back to it. Yes.
I think a lot of mayors or elected leaders are just trying to figure out how can we squeeze as much dollars to produce as many units in these places. That's been an ongoing challenge for years before federal, threats of federal cuts or anything like that. So whether the balance of, debt or operating, just cash or whatever, it's just, that's an exercise that a lot of these places where it remains a top priority of affordability, they're going to keep figuring out ways, whatever tools they can to get as much cash to get units produced and up, because it's also a timing game. Market rate is going to develop, right? So you got to get in front of that. You got to get the cash. You got to start the development, all of those things.
And so it's certainly a big initiative in Philadelphia, which is about to begin. So
I was just going to talk about the same affordability.
Yes,
that,
please, go for
as Matt correctly said, that has been a long-standing problem in the district. And the district many years ago set up a housing production trust fund, which they have tried to fund in order to help in terms of producing more affordable housing. And as Nick pointed out, in the district, for years, demand has outstripped supply, and it's still the case. And so you keep getting rising prices. And in spite of all the influx of new affordable housing, we're still having a gap between demand and supply. And so that continues to be a problem for the district.
How are you folks in the cities changing, or are you changing your disaster response strategies in light of what's going on at FEMA? But also, broadly speaking, what does it say about intergovernmental cooperation with your state and federal partners and your infrastructure needs? It's a narrow and a broad question at the same time. Maybe, Janet, do you want to start and talk about that some?
Well, I would say one of the biggest opportunities to me is local collaboration, getting rid of redundancies, sort of defragging the system. We've all had the luxury of operating in silos and kind of doing our own thing, and particularly, maybe my region, because of the clear path forward in a world with potentially declining state assistance and federal assistance.
You're still building things that stem from Superstorm Sandy, and even from 9/11. So what are you expecting out of the new administration in terms of disaster response and the federal role?
This has traditionally been an area where the federal government has played a central role in helping states and localities. There's been a lot of emphasis on disaster response, but I also want to highlight the federal government has historically played a very central role in preparedness, so helping states and localities build up their stockpiles of supplies, personal protective equipment, running scenarios. So our fire department and our police department and emergency management got federal funding to run scenarios about different disasters, setting up alert systems. So even the loss of this preparedness And then you have the immediate response, but also recovery. So the federal government would give community development block grants, disaster recovery funding to help rebuild, but rebuild with the intention of a smarter way, a more resilient buildings. We had Superstorm Sandy, you mentioned, caused massive flooding and power outages. How do we rebuild buildings to put critical mechanical systems on the roof rather than in the basement in anticipation of future floods? This is going to be a place, as Mayor mentioned, there's going to be a real need for intergovernment relations and really coordinating and thinking about how everyone can come to the table and what they bring and how to best utilize that and what's become a much more intricate puzzle.
And Nick, our friend Matt Fabian has forecast a surge of municipal bond issuance to deal with infrastructure hardening issues. What are you seeing from Moody's in your longer term expectations?
Yeah, I think in this context of disaster proneness, there's really two main credit things to think about. One is relatively short term, right? Which is you're a location that's had a natural disaster, flood, storm, extreme rainfall, wildfire, whatever it is. You are incurring expenditures immediately from day one. And so, the strongest governments in that perspective are the ones with the strongest liquidity and that have the most ability to navigate through that. An element of that has become, I guess, less certain now is the regime of how the federal government would begin to reimburse you and at what level has become less certain. Maybe it's going to take longer to get the reimbursements, and maybe it won't be at the 75 or 90% level that it was before. You may have to pick some of that up yourself. The longer term thing, Bill, that you really speak to is how does a government itself address its own adaptation needs relative to what its physical climate risk is, and that may be that there is some capital project that you can do that will absorb the water or keep the water from coming in. But, maybe that is longer term. Maybe it's a recognition that too much of our tax base is in the most at-risk areas. And maybe we should not be building as much in that location where the water is going to come, and do it in a different location or come up with other features like that. The other that, we didn't really, talk about is in the affordability context is property insurance, which has gotten extraordinarily expensive and has really, in many ways led to underinsurance in some instances. And so, how do you encourage your residents or your businesses to carry the right insurance? Do you have to subsidize it? There are states that subsidize property insurance, but those are new costs that you have to confront as well, so that there is money to rebuild after a disaster.
Thank you, Nick. And we will come back to the insurance question, which is certainly important, particularly in coastal states, California and Florida, and also for the Carolinas. I want to get to the question behind the question on disaster, and that is the relationship of local and state governments. And as the federal government retrenches and puts more responsibilities on state and local, the relationship between state and local. And Nick, you pointed out that even in growing cities like Raleigh, who the pressures to expand infrastructure and other basic services is important. Mayor Cowell, are you constrained by your relationship with your state government in your ability to serve your local constituents? And more generally, I want to others address that. Please, Mayor Cowell.
Yeah, well, and I'll just state on the storm, I am on a FEMA committee that meets tomorrow with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. That's because, of course, Hurricane Helene and the enormous impacts that had on North Carolina. And just to give you a sense, I think our combined budget for the state is about $26 billion, and it was $22 billion of damage with the hurricane, which just goes to show you that states and local municipalities cannot lift this burden of disaster recovery on their own. It's just way too enormous, and it's had ripple effects across the state as all the contractors have, gone over to the western part, abandoning, jobs down east where we are. So I will say, yes, of course, in North Carolina and in many states in the South, the state General Assembly has a lot of authority and power, and they have taken away a number of revenue sources for local government. That's why, I mentioned earlier that we do have a few local option revenue sources, but they are setting the rules, and it definitely impacts how we do our job as mayors.
So real importance on cooperation and the importance still of the federal government for disasters which go way beyond local and state capacity to respond to. With that, may I turn to Bill to wrap us up?
You bet. Thank you, Susan. And although I would like to continue this discussion on cities for another 2 hours, that's it for this edition of Special Briefing. We're just about out of time. Thank you so much to Susan Wachter, Mayor Cowell, and all of our panelists. There they are on the screen if you want to follow up with them. And special thanks to our production team, Megan Schmigdahl, Amy Montgomery, Alexa Halim, Noah Ritzenberg, Natalia Trujillo, and Divine Adenye. Thanks also to the Travelers Institute, the Volcker Alliance, and members of the Penn IUR Advisory Board for your generous support. We will be back on Thursday, February 19th. That's Thursday, February 19th, with a special briefing on America's housing challenge. And so until then, I'm Bill Glasgall on behalf of Susan Wachter and the special briefing team, and we'll see you again in February.